The moment my brother told me not to come to his wedding, I knew something in my family had already changed long before I ever picked up the phone. My name is Hannah Parker, and I still remember the exact sound of his voice that day, not loud, not emotional, but controlled in a way that made it feel like the decision had already been made without me. It was a Tuesday afternoon in my apartment in Boston, Massachusetts, around 3:40 de la tarde, when my phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. He expected something routine, maybe a reminder about wedding plans or family logistics, but instead I heard words that did not fit into anything I had prepared for. My brother, Ryan Parker, did not start with greetings or explanations. He simply said, "Please, don't come to my wedding." I remember sitting still for a second, thinking I had misheard him, because that kind of sentence does not belong in a normal family conversation. I asked him why immediately, my voice steady at first, assuming there had to be some misunderstanding, some temporary conflict, something that could be explained or fixed. That was when he paused, just long enough for the silence to feel intentional, and then he said it with a smirk I could almost hear through the phone, "I don't want you there." There was no further explanation, no emotional build-up, no attempt to soften it. Just that one sentence, delivered like a conclusion rather than a conversation. I remember standing up from my chair without realizing it, walking slowly toward my kitchen counter, holding the phone tighter as if pressure could somehow change what I had just heard. In that moment, I was not thinking about the wedding itself yet. I was thinking about how a family that had once shared holidays, birthdays, and years of memories could reach a point where exclusion was communicated so casually, so deliberately. My mother, Linda Parker, called me later that evening, but even she did not give clarity. She spoke carefully, choosing words that avoided responsibility, saying things like "it is complicated and you will understand later," phrases that explained nothing but confirmed everything was not being said openly. My father, Michael Parker, did not call at all. Instead, I received a short message from him that simply said we should respect Ryan's decision for now. No explanation, no context, just distance wrapped in formality. Over the next few days, I began to notice something else happening that made the situation feel even more unsettling. Family members who normally spoke freely around me started becoming selective in their conversations. Some avoided the topic entirely, while others hinted that there had been discussions I was not part of. It felt like I had been removed from a conversation that was still happening around me, just outside my reach. I tried to focus on the wedding itself, telling myself that maybe emotions were running high because of stress or planning pressure, but the more I thought about it, the less that explanation made sense. This was not a spontaneous argument. This was a decision that had structure behind it. And what made it more difficult was not just being excluded, but not being given a reason that could be understood or challenged. I found myself replaying the phone call repeatedly in my mind, analyzing every word, every pause, every tone shift, trying to find something that would make it logical instead of personal. But the more I analyzed it, the clearer it became that logic was not the point. Control was. And in the silence that followed, while invitations were still being prepared and guests were still being confirmed, I realized that I was no longer part of the version of the story my own family was preparing to present at my brother's wedding, and that realization was the first moment I understood this was not just about whether I would attend or not, but about why I had been removed from the story in the first place. After the phone call ended, I sat in silence longer than I expected, not because I was still in shock, but because I was trying to understand how a single sentence could completely redraw the boundaries of a family I had always assumed I belonged to without question. My name is Hannah Parker, and over the next few days, the silence that followed my brother Ryan Parker's decision not to have me at his wedding began to take on a structure of its own, one that felt less like absence and more like something carefully arranged. No one in my family directly explained anything to me, but that lack of explanation itself became a form of communication, because every interaction after that phone call felt filtered, measured, and deliberately incomplete. My mother, Linda Parker, spoke to me more often than my father, but her words were always indirect, as if she was trying to navigate around something she was not allowed to fully say. She would mention wedding preparations in passing, small details like seating arrangements or guest confirmations, but my name was never included in those conversations anymore, not even as a reference point. My father, Michael Parker, remained even more distant, responding only when necessary, and always with brief messages that carried no emotional context, only instruction or vague neutrality. It became increasingly clear that the decision my brother had made was not being treated as a temporary conflict, but as a finalized boundary that everyone else was expected to adapt to without question. What unsettled me most was not the exclusion itself, but how quickly the rest of the family adjusted to it as if it had always been part of the plan. He began noticing small indicators that confirmed this shift, such as conversations stopping when I entered a room, or changes in tone when my name was mentioned indirectly. At first, I tried to rationalize it as stress related to wedding planning, something temporary and emotionally charged that would resolve once the event passed. But the more I observed, the more it became clear that this was not spontaneous behavior. It was coordinated silence, not in an explicit or intentional way, but in the way people unconsciously align their communication when a shared decision has already been accepted without being openly discussed. I found myself replaying the original phone call repeatedly, analyzing not just what Ryan had said, but what he had not said, because the absence of explanation now felt more significant than the words themselves. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, only certainty, as if the decision had been finalized long before he called me. That realization shifted something in my understanding of the situation, because it suggested that I was not reacting to a sudden exclusion, but to the visible outcome of a decision that had been developing without my awareness. As the days passed, I stopped asking direct questions, not because I stopped caring, but because every attempt at clarity was met with responses that avoided structure. My mother would say things like everything would make sense soon, while my father would redirect the conversation entirely. Meanwhile, the wedding preparations continued in full visibility, with confirmations, arrangements, and discussions happening around me rather than including me. He began to understand that my role in this situation was no longer being debated within the family, but already positioned outside of it. And in that space of exclusion, where silence carried more information than words, I started paying closer attention not to what was being said, but to what was being consistently left unsaid, because that was where the real structure of the decision seemed to exist. As the days continued to pass after the initial phone call, I began to notice that the situation surrounding my exclusion from my brother Ryan Parker's wedding was no longer something that existed as a single decision communicated to me, but had instead evolved into an established structure within my family that shaped every interaction without needing to be openly acknowledged. My name is Hannah Parker, and by this point, I had stopped expecting direct explanations, because I had already experienced enough indirect communication to understand that silence itself had become the primary method through which information was being managed. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to engage in small conversations with me, but those conversations had narrowed significantly in scope, focusing almost entirely on logistical details of the wedding that no longer included my participation in any form. She would mention updates about scheduling or arrangements in a careful tone that avoided emotional weight, and every time she did, I became more aware that my absence was not being treated as temporary confusion, but as a fixed condition that had already been accepted internally. My father, Michael Parker, maintained even greater distance, communicating only when necessary and always in short, neutral statements that provided no insight into the reasoning behind the decisions that had been made. What became increasingly clear to me during this period was that the family dynamic had shifted from discussion to alignment, meaning that the focus was no longer on whether the decision made by Ryan was right or wrong, but on maintaining consistency around it. He began to observe small behavioral patterns that confirmed this shift, such as conversations stopping briefly when I entered a room, or topics changing when my presence altered the social atmosphere. These were not overt actions of exclusion, but subtle adjustments that revealed how deeply embedded the decision had become in everyday behavior. At the same time, wedding preparations continued with increasing intensity, And I noticed that updates about the event were shared freely among family members without my inclusion, reinforcing the sense that I was no longer part of the narrative being constructed around the ceremony. He initially tried to rationalize this as emotional discomfort or temporary tension caused by planning stress, but the consistency of the pattern made that explanation less and less convincing over time. Instead, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not a series of individual reactions, but a coordinated behavioral structure that had formed around a single unresolved decision. As I reflected on the original phone call more deeply, I started focusing less on the words that had been spoken and more on the certainty with which they were delivered, because that certainty suggested that the exclusion was not a spontaneous reaction, but the result of a process that had already been completed before it was ever communicated to me. This realization changed how I interpreted every interaction that followed, because it reframed them not as explanations of a decision still being formed, but as confirmations of a decision already finalized. He also began to notice that whenever the wedding was discussed in my presence, the conversation would subtly adjust its language, avoiding direct reference to my involvement or absence, which created a consistent pattern of omission that felt more structured than accidental. Over time, I stopped asking direct questions, not out of resignation, but because I recognized that the responses I was receiving were not designed to provide clarity, but to maintain alignment with an existing narrative. This shift forced me into a different role within my own family, one that required observation rather than participation, because participation no longer had access to the full context of what was happening. And in that observational space, where silence carried more meaning than speech, I began to focus on the underlying structure of how decisions were being reinforced without being openly discussed, because it was within that structure that I began to understand that my exclusion was not simply an isolated choice, but part of a larger system of narrative control that had already been set in motion long before I was ever informed of it. By the time I reached what felt like the next phase of this unfolding situation surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding, I had already stopped viewing it as a temporary misunderstanding or a family disagreement that would resolve itself after emotions cooled, because everything I had observed up to this point suggested that the structure of exclusion had already been fully integrated into how my family was operating around me. My name is Hannah Parker, and what became increasingly clear during this period was that my absence was no longer being treated as an active decision to justify, but as a settled condition that required no further discussion, as if my role had been quietly removed from the internal narrative of the event without any need for explanation. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to maintain surface-level communication with me, but her tone had become increasingly careful, as though every sentence was being filtered to avoid disrupting an unspoken agreement that existed beneath the conversation itself. She would still mention wedding-related topics, but always in a way that subtly reinforced distance, never directly acknowledging my position within those plans. My father, Michael Parker, remained largely unchanged in his emotional distance, offering only brief and functional responses when necessary, and avoiding any engagement that might require clarification of the reasoning behind the decisions that had been made. What I began to recognize during this stage was that the family dynamic had shifted from explanation to maintenance, meaning that the goal was no longer to justify the exclusion, but to preserve consistency around it so that it did not need to be re-examined. This created a pattern in which every interaction became a reinforcement of the same underlying structure, even when no one explicitly referred to it. At the same time, wedding preparations continued to progress in full visibility within the family, and I gradually became aware that information about the event was circulating freely among relatives and close contacts without ever reaching me directly, not through overt restriction, but through omission that felt increasingly deliberate in its consistency. He noticed that when I was present in conversations, topics related to the wedding would either shift slightly or be reframed in general terms that excluded specific details, creating an environment where I was physically present but informationally separated. Initially, I attempted to interpret this as discomfort or hesitation, assuming that people simply did not know how to navigate the situation, but the repetition of the same behavioral pattern across different contexts made that explanation less and less sustainable. Instead, I began to understand that what I was experiencing was not random avoidance, but a stabilized communication structure that had formed around my exclusion, one that functioned without requiring direct acknowledgement to remain effective. As I reflected further on the original phone call from Ryan Parker, I began to see it less as an isolated moment of rejection and more as the visible endpoint of a process that had already been developing before it was ever communicated to me. The certainty in his tone, the lack of explanation, and the absence of follow-up discussion all suggested that the decision had already been normalized internally within the family before it was ever presented to me as a statement. This realization changed the way I interpreted every subsequent interaction, because it revealed that I was not dealing with a decision that was still open to interpretation, but with one that had already been structurally closed within the family system. Over time, I stopped seeking clarification not because I stopped caring, but because I recognized that the responses I was receiving were not designed to provide insight, but to maintain alignment with a predetermined narrative. These forced me into a position of observation rather than participation, where I began focusing not on what was being said, but on what was consistently being left unspoken. And in that space of observation, I started to see the outline of something more systematic beneath the surface of family interactions, something that revealed how exclusion, once accepted at the narrative level, begins to reshape communication itself until even silence becomes part of its reinforcement. By the time I reached what felt like a deeper phase of understanding the situation surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding, I had already stopped expecting any meaningful clarification from within my family, because the pattern I was observing had become too consistent to be interpreted as temporary confusion or emotional avoidance. My name is Hannah Parker, and what I began to recognize during this stage was that my exclusion was no longer being treated as an active topic of discussion, but as an established condition that shaped how everyone interacted around me without ever needing to acknowledge it directly. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to engage with me in a careful and controlled manner, maintaining surface-level communication while avoiding any reference that would disrupt the underlying structure of what had already been accepted internally. My father, Michael Parker, remained even more distant, limiting his communication to brief and functional exchanges that carried no emotional context or explanatory depth, reinforcing the sense that clarity was no longer part of the interaction. What became increasingly apparent to me was that the family dynamic had shifted from decision-making to narrative maintenance, meaning that the focus was no longer on explaining why I had been excluded, but on preserving consistency so that the exclusion itself would not need to be re-examined. This created an environment where every conversation became subtly aligned with a predefined structure, even when no one explicitly referenced it. And over time this alignment became more noticeable in small behavioral patterns such as changes in tone, omission of details, and the redirection of topics whenever the wedding was mentioned in my presence. I began to notice that wedding-related information circulated freely among other family members, yet it consistently failed to reach me unless I actively sought it out, not through direct restriction, but through a form of passive omission that felt increasingly systematic rather than accidental. At first, I attempted to interpret this as discomfort or emotional uncertainty on the part of others, assuming that people were simply avoiding an awkward situation, but the repetition of the same behavior across multiple interactions made that explanation less and less convincing over time. Instead, I began to understand that what I was witnessing was a stabilized communication structure, one that functioned without requiring explicit agreement, because once a narrative becomes established within a group, it begins to regulate what is spoken, what is avoided, and what is considered unnecessary to clarify. As I reflected more deeply on the original phone call from my brother, I started to recognize that the tone and certainty in his voice were not isolated emotional choices, but indicators of a decision that had already been normalized internally before it was ever communicated to me. This realization changed how I interpreted every subsequent interaction, because it reframed my experience not as a sequence of personal rejections, but as exposure to an already completed internal agreement that I had been excluded from at an earlier stage. Over time, I stopped seeking clarification through direct questions, not out of resignation, but because I understood that the responses I was receiving were not designed to provide information, but to maintain consistency with a structure that had already been established. This forced me into a position of observation rather than participation, where I began focusing not on what was being said, but on what remained consistently unspoken across different interactions. In that observational space, I started to see that my exclusion was not an isolated decision tied only to the wedding, but part of a broader pattern of narrative control within family communication, where inclusion and exclusion were not openly discussed but quietly enforced through repetition, omission, and alignment with an accepted version of events that no longer required explanation to remain intact. By the time I reached what felt like the most revealing stage of my experience surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding, I had already transitioned fully into a state of observation rather than participation, because every interaction I had with my family now confirmed that the structure of exclusion was no longer being treated as a decision that needed justification, but as a stabilized reality that governed communication itself. My name is Hannah Parker, and what I began to understand during this phase was that the absence of explanation had become more important than explanation would have been, because it allowed the situation to remain functional without requiring anyone to confront its underlying reasoning. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to maintain her careful balance of engagement, speaking to me in a way that preserved normality on the surface while consistently avoiding any reference that would challenge the internal alignment already formed around my exclusion. My father, Michael Parker, remained even more detached, limiting his communication to brief acknowledgments that carried no interpretive depth, reinforcing a pattern in which emotional clarity was no longer part of the exchange. What stood out most clearly to me at this stage was that the wedding itself was no longer simply an event being prepared, but had become a structural reference point around which family communication was being organized, and within that structure, my presence existed only as an omission that did not require verbal acknowledgement to remain effective. He began to notice how consistently information related to the wedding flowed through indirect channels, where details were shared among certain members of the family but never extended to me unless I actively pursued them, creating a consistent pattern of selective visibility that felt increasingly systematic rather than situational. At first, I attempted to interpret this as emotional discomfort or social hesitation, assuming that people were simply trying to avoid tension, but the uniformity of the behavior across different contexts made that explanation less convincing over time. Instead, I began to recognize that what I was observing was not random avoidance, but a form of narrative stabilization, where communication naturally adjusts itself to align with an accepted version of events once that version has been established within the group. This meant that my exclusion was no longer being enforced through explicit statements, but through repeated patterns of omission that required no active decision to maintain once they had become normalized. As I reflected more deeply on my original phone call with Ryan Parker, I began to understand that the certainty in his voice was not an isolated emotional expression, but a reflection of a decision that had already been integrated into the Famyly's internal narrative before it was ever communicated to me. This realization reframed every interaction that followed, because it suggested that I was not dealing with an evolving situation, but with the visible outcome of a process that had already been completed at a structural level. Over time, I stopped seeking clarification through direct questions, not because I lost interest in understanding, but because I recognized that the responses I was receiving were not designed to provide information, but to preserve consistency with an established framework that no longer required explanation to function. This shift forced me into a position where observation became the only meaningful form of engagement, and in that position, I began to focus not on explicit statements, but on patterns of repetition, omission, and alignment that revealed how deeply the exclusion had been embedded into everyday communication. What became increasingly clear was that the wedding was not simply the focal point of a family event, but the mechanism through which a broader narrative structure was being maintained, and within that structure, my absence had been transformed from a decision into an assumption that no longer needed to be spoken in order to remain active. And in recognizing that, I understood that the most significant change was not in what had been said to me, but in how silence itself had been reorganized to sustain a version of reality in which my place no longer existed without requiring anyone to explicitly acknowledge that fact. By the time I reached what felt like the most critical turning point in my understanding of the situation surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding, I had already fully accepted that what I was dealing with was no longer an unfolding family disagreement, but a stabilized narrative structure that had been reinforced through repetition, omission, and collective alignment within my family system. My name is Hannah Parker, and during this stage, I began to see with increasing clarity that my exclusion was not being maintained through active decisions or ongoing discussions, but through the absence of contradiction, meaning that nothing needed to be said anymore in order for the situation to remain unchanged. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to interact with me in a controlled and careful manner, maintaining a surface-level normality that allowed conversations to continue without ever touching the underlying structure that had already been established around the wedding. My father, Michael Parker, remained distant and functionally engaged only when necessary, offering responses that contained no interpretive depth, reinforcing the sense that emotional context had been removed from family communication entirely. What became increasingly evident to me during this period was that the wedding itself had transformed from a planned event into a narrative anchor point, meaning that all communication within the family was now being shaped around maintaining consistency with a version of events that no longer included my presence as a variable requiring explanation. He noticed that conversations related to the wedding continued to circulate freely among certain family members, yet my involvement was never referenced unless I explicitly brought it up, at which point the discussion would either shift or conclude without clarification. This pattern was no longer isolated or accidental, but consistent across different contexts, which made it clear that the structure of exclusion had become embedded in communication behavior itself. At first, I attempted to interpret these patterns as emotional avoidance, assuming that people were simply uncomfortable addressing tension directly, but over time I realized that avoidance alone could not explain the level of consistency I was observing. Instead, what I was seeing was a form of narrative stabilization, where once a version of events becomes widely accepted within a group, communication naturally reorganizes itself to preserve that version without requiring explicit enforcement. This meant that my absence from the wedding was no longer something that needed to be decided or justified in conversation, but something that functioned as an assumed condition within all related discussions. As I reflected again on the original phone call from Ryan Parker, I began to understand that the certainty in his tone was not a reflection of a momentary emotional decision, but an indication that the outcome had already been integrated into the Famyly's internal structure before it was ever communicated to me. This realization fundamentally changed how I interpreted every subsequent interaction, because it revealed that I was not responding to an evolving situation, but to the visible effects of a decision that had already been fully absorbed into the Famyly's collective understanding. Over time, I stopped attempting to extract clarity through direct questions, not because I no longer cared about understanding, but because I recognized that the responses I was receiving were not designed to provide information, but to maintain alignment with a narrative framework that no longer required explanation to remain stable. This shift placed me entirely in the position of observer, where my focus moved away from spoken communication and toward the structural patterns underlying it, particularly repetition, omission, and consistent redirection. What I began to see more clearly was that the wedding was not simply an event being prepared, but a mechanism through which the family maintained narrative consistency, and within that mechanism, my absence had become a fixed assumption rather than an active topic. And in recognizing this, I understood that the most significant transformation was not in what had been explicitly decided, but in how silence itself had evolved into a reinforcing system that allowed exclusion to persist without ever needing to be spoken again. By the time I reached what felt like the final stage of observation before everything surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding moved into its irreversible phase, I had already fully accepted that the situation was no longer defined by personal conflict or emotional disagreement, but by a stabilized narrative structure that had become self-sustaining within my family. My name is Hannah Parker, and at this point, I understood that my exclusion was no longer being treated as something that required explanation, or even discussion, but as an established condition that shaped all communication without ever needing to be explicitly referenced. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to maintain her careful pattern of interaction with me, preserving surface-level normality while consistently avoiding any direct engagement with the underlying structure that defined the wedding narrative. My father, Michael Parker, remained emotionally distant and functionally minimal in communication, reinforcing a pattern in which clarity was no longer part of family interaction, only alignment with an already accepted version of events. What became increasingly clear to me during this stage was that the wedding had evolved into more than a planned ceremony. It had become a central organizing point for family communication, meaning that every conversation, every omission, and every selective detail was now oriented around maintaining consistency with a version of reality that no longer included my participation as a necessary component. He noticed that discussions about the wedding continued to circulate freely among certain family members, yet my presence was consistently absent from those exchanges unless I directly introduced the topic, at which point the conversation would either shift or conclude without clarification. This pattern was no longer variable or situational, but consistent enough across different contexts that it revealed an underlying structure rather than individual behavior. At first, I attempted to interpret this as emotional avoidance or discomfort, assuming that people were simply trying to prevent conflict, but the more I observed, the more I understood that avoidance alone could not account for the level of coherence in the pattern. Instead, what I was witnessing was a form of narrative stabilization, where once a version of events becomes widely accepted within a group, communication naturally reorganizes itself to preserve that version without requiring explicit enforcement or explanation. This meant that my exclusion was no longer something being actively decided in conversations, but something already embedded in the assumptions guiding those conversations. As I reflected again on the original phone call from Ryan Parker, I began to recognize that the certainty in his tone was not an isolated emotional choice, but a reflection of a decision that had already been integrated into the Famyly's internal structure before it was ever communicated to me. This realization shifted my entire perspective, because it revealed that I was not dealing with an ongoing negotiation or evolving disagreement, but with the observable effects of a conclusion that had already been reached elsewhere and simply transmitted to me as a finalized outcome. Overtime, I stopped seeking clarification through direct questioning, not because I had lost interest in understanding, but because I realized that the responses I received were not designed to provide information, but to maintain consistency with a narrative framework that no longer required justification to remain stable. These forced me fully into the role of observer, where my attention shifted away from explicit statements and towards structural patterns such as repetition, omission, and consistent redirection across interactions. What became increasingly undeniable was that the wedding itself functioned as more than an event. It operated as a mechanism through which narrative coherence was maintained within the family system, and within that mechanism, my absence had become a fixed assumption rather than an active point of discussion. And in understanding this, I recognized that the most profound transformation was not in what had been said to me directly, but in how silence itself had been reorganized into a system capable of sustaining exclusion without ever needing to acknowledge it openly again. By the time I reached what I understood to be the final stage of everything surrounding my brother Ryan Parker's wedding, I had already stopped expecting any further clarification, because what had once felt like an unresolved family situation had fully transitioned into a complete and stable narrative structure that no longer required explanation to function within my family. My name is Hannah Parker, and at this point, I understood that my exclusion was no longer something being actively discussed or reconsidered, but something that had already been fully absorbed into how my family communicated, organized information, and maintained consistency in their interactions. My mother, Linda Parker, continued to interact with me in a controlled and careful manner, preserving surface-level normality while consistently avoiding any reference that would disrupt the underlying structure that had been established around the wedding. My father, Michael Parker, remained distant and functionally minimal in communication, reinforcing a pattern where emotional context was no longer part of family dialogue, only alignment with an accepted version of reality that no longer included my participation as a variable requiring attention. What became most evident to me during this stage was that the wedding had completely evolved beyond a personal or even family event, becoming instead a structural reference point that organized communication itself, meaning that every interaction, omission, and redirection now functioned in relation to maintaining coherence with a version of events that excluded me by default. He noticed that wedding-related discussions continued freely among certain family members, yet my name or presence never naturally appeared in those conversations unless I directly introduce it. And even then the conversation would subtly shift or conclude without further detail, reinforcing the same consistent pattern I had observed throughout this entire process. Overtime, I stopped interpreting this as emotional avoidance, because avoidance implies awareness of tension, whereas what I was observing was far more systematic, resembling a stabilized communication model where exclusion had already been normalized to the point that it no longer required active reinforcement. Instead, it operated through repetition and omission, which together formed a structure strong enough to sustain itself without explanation. As I reflected again on the original phone call from Ryan Parker, I began to recognize that the certainty in his tone was not simply emotional conviction, but an indication that the decision had already been integrated into the Famyly's shared internal narrative long before it was communicated to me. This realization reframed every interaction that followed, because it revealed that I was not navigating an unfolding disagreement, but rather the aftereffects of a conclusion that had already been fully established elsewhere and only revealed to me in its final form. In the absence of direct explanation, I had been forced into a position of continuous observation, where meaning had to be derived not from explicit statements, but from structural patterns such as repetition, omission, and selective communication across contexts. What became increasingly clear was that the wedding itself functioned as more than an event. Being prepared, it operated as a mechanism through which narrative consistency was maintained within the family system, and within that mechanism, my absence was not treated as something to justify, but as something already assumed and therefore no longer requiring acknowledgement. And in recognizing this, I understood that the most significant transformation was not in any single conversation or decision, but in how silence itself had been reorganized into a reinforcing system capable of preserving exclusion without ever needing to state it again, turning absence into a permanent and unspoken structure within the Famyly's shared reality.